Everybody knows that climate change is already having impacts all the way around the world, and we know in the future it's going to be much worse. A lot of people are going to have to move to places that are more hospitable. So in this video, we're going to try and understand how people are going to move, where they're going to move to. There are two basic ways climate change will have impacts. First of all, it'll have short-term impacts, such as storms or weather events that cause people to move temporarily away from their homes, but then hopefully return more quickly. Even though they might have lost everything, they will still be able to stay where they lived. And the second way is where the long-term trend in climate change will make it impossible for people to stay where they are, and they will have to move. First of all though, let's try and understand how serious things are already. Parts of India, the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of California and the southern Gulf of Mexico are already experiencing heat stress conditions approaching the upper limits of labour productivity and human survivability. The risk of heat stress is particularly high in cities. At the moment, there are about 600 million people who are living conditions that are considered to be outside the long-term sustainability for humans. It's called the human climate niche. It's thought that by the year 2100, 1/3 of the world's population, if they were to stay where they are now, would be living outside of the conditions where you could reasonably expect humans to continue to live. One of the reasons climate change will cause so many people to move is that we already live in a world that's very unstable. Somewhere between 3 and 4% of the world's population lives in countries where they weren't born, and there are all sorts of other stresses such as war and conflict, and in places like Africa there's a large young population, birth rate's quite high, and it's already struggling to keep up with the demands of this new young population. By 2050, 1 in every 4 people of working age in the world will be African. Over 100 million jobs are needed for the youths that joined the labour force in the last 10 years. The continent was barely able to create remunerative jobs for 37 million people. Poor quality education and a lack of skills limit employment opportunities for young people. Youth unemployment is a whopping 50% in some countries. Remember that climate change has already caused Syria to collapse into civil war and for millions of refugees to take shelter in adjacent countries. Climate change is also a threat multiplier. In many of today's conflicts, from Darfur to Somalia to Iraq and Syria, the Arab Spring is commonly seen as leading to serious conflict. But people tend to forget the 5-year drought in Syria's northeast that preceded the war and the displacement of some 1.5 million people. Climate change sows the seeds of conflict, but it also makes displacement much worse when it happens. I was going to try and plot human migration into the future decade by decade. That was just impossible. So instead we'll look at some milestones. So by 2050, it's thought there could be as many as 1,000 million people who've been forced to migrate due to climate change. Parts of Africa and India will be regularly above 35 degrees Celsius over 100 days a year, which will be a great impact on those parts of the world. You might think to yourself, well, I don't live in Africa or Asia, but for example in the United States, in New York, there are 20 million people who rely on water and power that will have to be moved because it will be at risk of flooding. The New York transport system will have to completely change. By 2050, approximately 1.2 million people living in Louisiana will be affected by sea level rise, and many of them are going to have to move. It seems that Florida is doomed to be lost. Fort Lauderdale will be lost by 2040, Miami by 2050, and Key West will be lost by 2060. So people in Florida will have to move, which will be a bit of a shock because I get an impression from their governor, DeSantis, he doesn't believe in climate change at all. So they've got something to wake up to. By 2080, we could have 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming, and that will mean farming in Europe, in the southern half of Europe at least, will need to be abandoned. Plus, European industry will need to migrate from the south to the north. Beyond 2.5 degrees Celsius of global warming, transitional adaptation is needed to lower risk levels, such as planned relocation of industry, abandonment of farmland, or development of alternative livelihoods. And then, by the year 2100, it looks as though it's just going to be complete chaos. Remember, 80% of the Himalayan glaciers will have melted, or 2 billion people rely on that water. for drinking water and for farming. Between about half and 3/4 of the global population could be exposed to periods of life-threatening climate conditions due to extreme heat and humidity. A third of people will be outside the human climate niche. There'll be hundreds of millions of people in coastal areas in China at risk from rising sea levels and increased storm activity. Plus, there'll be the AMOC, which will have devastating effects on humans living in Europe if it reaches its tipping point. AMOC is Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation Current. Although I did see something recently that said maybe the AMOC isn't slowing down as much as people thought, so maybe there's some hope there. Anyway, whatever's going on in the year 2100, people are going to have to move. The first type of migration then is involuntary, and it's normally caused by what's called rapid onset events: floods, fires, storms. Everyone has to move, the whole family. You don't move that far, hopefully you'll be coming back soon. The good thing about them though is there's no dilemma, there's no thinking, shall we wait a bit longer to see if we can hang on? You have to move, and it's obvious to everyone that it's beyond your control. So people see your event in the news, your government, people in overseas, and they want to help you. You might lose everything you own, there might be a great loss of life, but as we'll see in a minute, this type of migration is the best type to have, because you may have lost everything, houses may have been completely destroyed, but sooner or later you will return to your land, you will rebuild your house, schools will be rebuilt, the children who used to go to that school, most of them will still be in the area, so things will get back to normal. Most of these type of events are caused by flooding or storms, and you might think, well, I don't live in a part of the world that's affected by that. Here's a map that shows all the causes of people being displaced between 2018 and 2024. Wherever you live in the world, you are going to be affected. You may have been affected already. As climate change progresses, these extreme weather events will happen more often, and when they do happen, they will be more extreme. So if you live in the western half of the United States, it's likely you will be moved by fire, which is red dots for fire. If you live in the east coast of the United States, you will be displaced by flooding, which is dark blue, or storms, which is light blue. The Mediterranean, fire and floods. Northern Europe, fires, floods and storms. Africa is flooding. You might be surprised that so many causes of displacement in Africa is caused by flooding. But if you look at this map of the world, you can see how verdant and green Central Africa is, how much rain it must get to support that. And then along the coast of China, can you see how many people are already being displaced by light blue, that's storms, and how large those circles are. That the bigger the circle, the more people are being displaced. So when people say by the year 2100, 400 million Chinese living in coastal areas will be affected by rising sea levels and increased storm levels, it's already happening now. You don't need too much of an imagination to see that in the future it's going to be a much bigger problem. And here's a chart that shows how many people are displaced each year, and by the type of event. Is somewhere around 20 million people are displaced each year. 3/4 of them are displaced by flooding. And it shows you Asia, that's where most of the disasters happen, that's where most of the people are affected. Africa, North America, Europe, Australia, Central South America. Really, wherever you live in the world, you are going to be affected by these short-term weather events that hopefully will only have short-term impacts. And to explain this a bit more, we're going to use the example of the flooding that happened in Pakistan in 2022. 33 million people were affected. Nearly 2 million homes were destroyed. Nearly 2,000 people were killed. But as climate change things go, this one isn't too bad, because after about a year, just about everyone had returned to their village. And it sounds quite good, doesn't it? We don't need to worry about these extreme weather events, because they're only short impact events, and people only migrate a short distance. But listen to the human impacts. This is a case study for one family who had to move. There was a husband and wife, and I think they had 3 or 4 children. Let's see. Ghulam Nabi, 42, lost everything when the flood swept through his town of Fazlpur. At first, he, his wife and 5 children moved into a school that had been turned into a public shelter for the homeless, but when it became overcrowded, they moved to a tent. Me and my pregnant wife were just living on water with no food available to us. It wasn't even enough for our 4 children, he said. Living anywhere after being displaced is not easy. I pray that no one faces this situation. What's interesting is, this isn't the first time it's happened in that area. So in 2022, 33 million people were affected. I think they worked out something like 30 or 40 billion dollars of damage done. In 2020, there was, if I can find it, $88.5 billion of damage done in India, $15 billion in Sri Lanka, $1.5 billion of damage done in Pakistan, 6,500 fatalities. Plus, in 2023, when they were still trying to clear up the impacts of the flooding from 2022, there was a great monsoon that slowed down recovery. And one of the interviews for the 2022 flood said there were still schools that had been damaged by flooding in 2010 that hadn't been repaired, and they would need to be sorted out as well. So you might think to yourself, if they had floods in 2010, 2022, 2020 and 2023, they must think to themselves, well, how much longer have we got? Why don't we all move? Well, if you're a Pakistani villager who hasn't got any food to eat after the flood, you've got only water to drink, a pregnant wife, 5 children, where are you going to go? There's 33 million of them. How could they ever move? Remember, they're mostly farmers, they're tied to the land. When their crops were damaged by the flooding, a lot of them became bankrupt. They couldn't pay back the money that they'd borrowed to buy the seed to grow their crops. These people are said to be immobile. As we see later on, if you're a mobile person or an immobile person, has a big effect on how you respond to climate change and your chances of survival. These type of events, rapid onset events, are classed as loss and damage under the Paris 2015 Climate Agreement, and one of the things they highlight is, in that agreement, the importance of a warning system. So if you live in one of these countries, in the blue area, then you've got a warning system that your government has quietly set up so as not to alarm you, to let you know when there's an emergency about to happen. And there are 4 stages they've gone through. First of all, they identify what the risks are. Number 2, they monitor them. Number 3, they warn you about them. And number 4, they have a plan to respond. Your government might not have told you, but they will have had something set up like this. Now we get to the permanent, long-distance type of migration that's caused by what's called slow onset effects, such as rising sea levels, increases in temperatures, and increasing in drought. This one is voluntary, or at least it's voluntary at first, and it's seen as a respectable way to adapt to the climate. Migration, including rural-urban migration, is also recognised as an adaptation strategy in some circumstances, whether this is voluntary or planned. Voluntary migration can be an element of household strategies to diversify risk depending on the nature of the climatic stress, and interacts with household composition, individual characteristics, social networks, and historical, political and economic contexts. This type of migration, it disrupts your family structure, it disrupts your social network. Whole societies will have to move, or they'll be disrupted. Not everyone will move at the same time, because whether you decide to move or not depends on if you've got somewhere to move to, if you know people in a new area who can sort of help you to get there. Depends on how mobile you are. If you're a young person, doesn't own any land, doesn't have a family, it's much easier to move than if you're an older person who owns land, who has a family. If you're one of the 100 million young Africans who don't have a job, it's much easier to move, or to try to move. Because it's voluntary though, this introduces a dilemma, because you've got to decide whether to go or whether to stay. You've got to decide where you want to go to. Moving is a new thing, it involves risk. There are some people who will move somewhere where they might have to move a second time, depending on how climate change progresses. Also, there are examples of where people have moved from the countryside into towns to work in the hope of returning back to their farms. So, for example, in India, where drought is a growing problem, there was a case of some villagers, they left their farms, they worked in the town, and they used the money that they earned in the town to pay for drilling water. And at first it was quite successful. They could pump the water, they could go back to farming. But so many people were pumping water in the end, the aquifers were drained, so they could no longer get enough water to carry on farming. So all of that work in the towns was wasted. That's what the United Nations would call maladaptation. So there's a dilemma, whether to go or not, where to go and what to do. When it comes to that dilemma of when to go, it's much easier to decide to move if the type of impact you're facing is almost inevitable, such as rising sea levels that are increasing at quite a steady, measurable impact. When it comes to the impacts of drought and temperature, depending what the El Nino is doing, that can be quite variable, so it's not quite so obvious. But the sooner you go, the better, because it will be voluntary. You can decide where you want to go. As temperatures increase, it's thought that what is now a voluntary move will soon become involuntary when we get to about 2 degrees Celsius of warming. In small town Pakistan and Colombia, heat stress increases long-term migration of men, driven by a negative effect on farm income. A study from Mexico reveals that an increase in drought months led to increased rural to urban migration, while increased heat led to a non-linear pattern of rural-urban migration that occurred only after extended periods of heat, nearly 34 months. This aligns with our findings that a consistent increase in temperature between 2 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius in some parts of the world renders involuntary forced migration inevitable. There are 3 important pieces of information in that short piece of text. First of all, what might appear to be an economic reason to move, because farm incomes are down, is really caused by climate change. When you have an extreme weather event which looks very spectacular in the news, everyone knows it's an extreme weather event possibly caused by climate change. If you're moving from the countryside to a town for economic reasons, it's not so obvious that you're moving because of climate change, and you're much less likely because of that to get help. The second piece of information is if there's a drought, people will try to go into the towns to work in the hope of returning to their land when the rains come. But if it's because of heat, well, it just makes living much more difficult. It doesn't matter if you have a job in the town. So if you're suffering the effects of heat, then you have to move. And the third piece of important information in that text was, as the effects of heat increase, the number of people migrating increases non-linearly. It increases exponentially. Everyone who's interested in climate change knows when you have an exponential change, the rate of change increases. So you might have a small number of people migrating at first, but it's not linear, it doesn't just go up in a straight line. The rate increases, so you can go from a small number of people migrating to a large number of people migrating very quickly, which is something you look at for tipping points. It seems as like there's a human tipping point as well, that suddenly huge numbers of people move when temperatures reach a certain level, somewhere between 2 degrees Celsius and 4 degrees Celsius. Sadly, it's the poorest people in the world who are suffering the slow onset impacts of climate change the most. Most people vulnerable to slow onset climate change live in parts of Africa, Near East and Central Asia. These people need help now. Whatever you decide to do though, wherever you decide to go, if you can, it's best to stay in your own country, because as soon as you go into another country, most people, if they do cross a national boundary, will just stay in a neighbouring country. But as soon as they get there, suddenly they lose a lot of support from the government. They have far fewer rights. There is no such thing as a climate refugee. The word refugee has very strict legal terms, and it means you're fleeing from either war or from persecution. If you're fleeing a war or persecution, whatever country you end up in, that country is bound to help you by international law. If you're fleeing climate change, that law does not apply. There was one case in New Zealand where someone said, I'm fleeing climate change. They refused his appeal and they sent him back. This was something that was realised in the Paris 2015 climate agreement, that you have no legal right to flee climate change and no other country has a legal obligation to help you. And the Paris 2015 agreement was written in a way, which is common to all the things in there, is it realises a problem, it does mention it, but it doesn't actually put any duties on countries to do something about it. There's something in there about it needs to be discussed by the Warsaw Committee. But I don't think anything's happened. Certainly at the moment, there's no legal right to flee climate change. You're expected to stay in your own country and suffer. We ought to give a shout out, though, to Turkey. At the moment, there are something like 80 million people who live in Turkey, I think, and of that, 3.6 million are refugees from mostly from the war in Syria. And quite often when you hear politicians talk about refugees and asylum seekers, they may be, if they want to say something positive about why we should have refugees and look after them, they might say, oh, well, it's good for our economy, our economies need new people to come and work for us. Not in Turkey. In Turkey, so many refugees is causing them a problem. House prices are up, transport's more difficult, there's less food, there's less resources. The standard of living of ordinary Turks is going down because of this new stress on their economy. The Turks don't say it's good for our economy or anything like that. The Turks are doing it because they say it's a moral aspect. They feel a moral duty to help their fellow humans. It's not like the capitalist global north, is it? Turkey is a Muslim country, and it seems to me they're very moral in these sorts of things, so there's a lesson for all of us there. The general rule seems to be for people affected by slow onset climate impacts is they have to look after themselves, they're on their own. But there are growing examples of where governments are helping their people, especially in response to rising sea levels, which is obvious to people that there's no way of avoiding it, you have to tackle it. And in those cases, the golden rule is you give people money to compensate them for losing their house and their land, and then they have the freedom to go off and choose where else to live. What's curious is the United States of America has a reputation for not taking climate change seriously, and in one very important example, just about every member of the Senate voted against the United States committing to making reductions in its CO2 emissions, possibly because of the influence of the big oil companies. But when it comes to helping its own people out, it seems much more willing to accept that climate change is happening. So, for example, there is a federal scheme to compensate people to move, and one case I looked at, they moved about, 20 houses, and each house on average cost about $40,000 they had to pay in compensation. And those houses were knocked down. The planning regulations for that part of the land was changed, so you couldn't build houses on it again, and it was just given back to nature. Here's in Louisiana, they're paying about $100,000 per person to move them. Here's an example of how America is doing something to tackle climate change and taking it seriously. Climate change possesses significant risks both to coastal and inland communities in Louisiana. Through the Coastal Master Plan, the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority and the state are doing incredible work to stabilise our coast to reduce the vulnerability of our coastal communities. The structural and non-structural adaptation measures that the CPRA is currently undertaking will protect our coast for the next 30 to 50 years, giving us time to proactively prepare and adapt for people having to leave their homes due to environmental stress. So $100,000 per person in the United States. If you live in the Philippines, if you're one of the 200,000 people who lives in coastal areas that's being moved because in 2013 something like 8,000 people were killed during a typhoon, so they need to move people away from the coast. 200,000 people are being moved. They're not giving you £100,000 each. They're organising the move for you. They'll build new houses away from the coast. The two things everyone's concerned about is they want tenure. They want to own their own properties. You're moving them. They want to have some sort of security, and they want to be able to get to work. Well, if you're moving 200,000 people, you can't please everyone. You can't make sure everyone is still going to be able to have a job or to get to their existing work by the time they've moved. The concern is a lot of those people, they'll be moved to the new town, whatever, but they'll leave. They'll just come back to the coastline again, because that's where their lives are. That's where they can earn a living. And the most vulnerable places, whether it's the Philippines or anywhere else, tend to have the poorest people living there, because if you have some money, you'll move to a much more secure place anyway. So in these situations, the poorest people aren't necessarily treated the fairest, which is common in most politics, isn't it, really? But Bangladesh has a much more positive example. Every year, something like 200,000 people need to move because of rising sea levels. Over nearly the last 30 years, Bangladesh has built enough houses to house about 2 million people, which works out at something like 90,000 people a year. So 200,000 people are being disrupted, having to move, being displaced. Of that, 90,000 are being rehoused by the Bangladesh government, and they build these blocks of small houses. Each house has about 2 to 3 rooms. The average family in Bangladesh is somewhere between 4 and 5. And not only do they make sure your new house has tenure, that you own your new house, but they're providing training and social and community support. So they're trying to do a good job. They're not able to help everyone, maybe nearly half of them. Of those they can't help, I think most people go and live in the cities. About 70% of them end up living in the slums. But as well as the 200,000 people that are officially recognised as being displaced by rising sea levels, there are another 100,000 people who move from Bangladesh to India each year looking for work, because they've lost their land. So again, if you're moving for economic reasons, it's quite possible climate change has an impact on that as well, but it just goes missed, it just goes unnoticed. And instead of $100,000 per person, it works out that Bangladesh spends about $700 per house per family, so it's quite good value for money. They have got troubles in some places where the land wasn't very suitable, but if you're rehousing 90,000 people a year and you're a poor country, I think you've got to be realistic in the quality you can achieve. I hope you've remembered to be thinking about how you would respond if you were in this situation, what type of migration you might end up having to do. Can you imagine, where would you go? When would you go? How would you get there? How bad would things have to be for you to want to give up everything that you've worked for, or your friends and family? It's a real dilemma, isn't it? But a lot of people are already having to do this in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Louisiana, in parts of Africa. A lot of people won't be able to move at all. They won't have anywhere to go. They'll be too immobile. They'll be too attached to the place they live, that when climate change starts having slight impacts, well, it's already having major impacts, but in your area, some people will leave straight away. They might not realise they're climate migrants. They might just think, I'm moving for economic reasons. As the climate impacts get worse and worse, more and more people will go. But the people who don't move will be the most immobile. And well, if they're immobile, as climate change progresses, as it becomes more difficult to move, there's a concern that growing numbers of people won't be able to move at all. Some individuals can adapt in place, while many people do not have the capability to move, and others might be able to, but are reluctant to leave homelands to which they feel bound. When migration is not a viable option, people who are unable or unwilling to move may be the ones most negatively affected by climate change, as they become trapped in increasingly uninhabitable locations. There is an example of that sort of thing happening in the Second Congo War. The Second Congo War started in 1998 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It led to the 6 million people being internally displaced within Congo, and another 1 million people going to neighbouring countries. So 7 million people altogether were displaced. But another 5 million people died, mostly due to malnutrition and disease. Why didn't those 5 million people move? Well, probably because they were immobile. So these things can happen. Millions of people can die. Do you remember the Second Congo War? Nobody does. Here's a case study from the drought in Kenya in 2022, and about how the people who could go left to try and find a survivable place. They had to leave behind the elderly and the disabled to their fate. We lost all our grazing land and food security when the locusts came in 2019. We then switched to herding livestock, but now the drought has made our livestock weak, and thus our livelihood and even our ability to educate our children is weak in Turkana. Many people are too weak to migrate to Uganda, cannot afford the water and food for the 10-day journey, or are reluctant to leave their homes. The people there have suffered 2 disasters in quick succession, one in 2019 when they gave up growing crops, and now a second one in 2022. And as you might know from a previous video, a society can cope with one, probably quite a serious problem, but societies collapse or brought under severe stress either they have 2 problems at the same time or one problem after the other when they haven't had time to recover from the first problem. So they're in a difficult situation. They're in a situation where they can't help everyone. The young travelled to Uganda, taking what remaining livestock have survived from our community, while the elderly and disabled remain behind, praying to God to bring the rain. That's pretty much the end of the video. Millions of people will migrate if they can find somewhere to migrate to, but a lot of people are stuck. The 33 million people living in Pakistan suffering devastating floods on a regular basis. Where will they go? Who will help them to get there? So, a lot of people will migrate. A lot of people will be stuck.